Welcome to the FMCG Guys, the podcast that dives into the innovation, strategy, and trends shaping consumer goods and retail in Europe and beyond.
Welcome to the FMCG Guys podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Torres. If this is the first time you tune in, you'll want to know that this is the top podcast in consumer goods and retail in Europe. We're now over 200 episodes in, and by the time this airs, probably over 22,000 followers on LinkedIn. So thanks everyone for that. However, today we'll travel to another region of the world, no other than Latin America. And we'll also go into a function that we have not covered that extensively on the podcast, which is finance. And that's why I have the pleasure to be accompanied today by no other than Jose Salas, who's the Finance Director, Latin America and Caribbean at the iconic sportswear brand Reebok. Hi, Jose. How are you? Nice to join. Nice to have you with me today.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you very much. Happy to be here and get to know a little bit more about the great podcast you have.
Yeah, it's funny because when we prepared a bit for the interview and so on, we were speaking in Spanish, but we have to change the chip for the interview.
Exactly. No, and as I told you, this is my first time, so let's take it easy.
Well, you're starting good then. You're starting with a good podcast at least. So you're sitting in Panama, right? How are things over there?
Yeah, I'm actually based in Panama. Now I think it's I've been moving a lot between Latin America, but it's maybe my 7 or 8 year here in Panama.
Wow.
I came here with Diageo, and now I'm actually with Reebok. So been moving a lot of experience with different companies in FMCG. So.
And how is it to live in Panama?
It's really cool. It's really hot. I'm actually Peruvian, so my weather is actually regular, so it's not as hot as here. But it's a really nice country.
Yeah, I guess the food is not as good as in Peru, no?
I thought that, but there are quite a few places that are good. You have a good Italian places, burgers, steaks. So yeah, I think it's quite nice.
Ah, fantastic. So you mentioned you're originally from Peru. You've worked with a lot of companies in your career. Also looking at your LinkedIn, a lot of blue chip companies there. Can you tell us like a bit of a summary of your career so far?
Yeah, so I have maybe between 16 and 17 years of career. I started working in audit firms like KPMG and Deloitte before I finished the university. But the FMCG market was always appealing for me. I have a lot of friends working in Procter and in Adidas. So there was an opportunity that jumped in while I was working in KPMG to work in Colgate. Great experience for me. That was the first time that I had 2 bosses, line manager in finance and line manager in commercial. So since the beginning, I had the experience of working with both sides of the business. So great experience for me. I played this strategy to actually move between jobs between 2 and 3 years. So I moved to PepsiCo, reported to the general manager, part of an Andean executive committee, then moved to a joint venture called Procter & Gamble and Teva, which is an Israeli company with the benefits of what Procter brings. So
does that joint venture still exist, by the way?
No, actually no.
Yeah,
I had like the last curve of the JV, but it was a really good experience. I met a lot of people. They're great leaders. Learned a lot also from P&G because it was really involved in what PGT used to be. And then I jumped to Diageo. I did a little bit more than 7 years in Diageo, 2 different regions, working with different markets, different projects. I got a chance to work with global brand teams, global brand directors, for markets I wouldn't even imagine I would have worked with, maybe such as, Ireland, India. And it was a great experience. And then I jumped to now with Reebok for Latin America, maybe a little bit more than 6 months ago. I'm really excited to be here now. co-piloting is what I've been working on most in my 16-year career. So that's probably what we'll be talking about a little bit more here.
Well, and yeah, I have a couple of questions. First of all, you move between a lot of companies in a similar sector, FMCG, apparel. Well, you were in KPMG and Deloitte, which is very different, but obviously very different cultures. How have you personally been able to adapt to like all these different cultures and surroundings and actually be successful?
At the beginning of my career, I had one of, I think it was in KPMG. I met a guy called Juan Carlos Vidal, which was someone that actually inspired me to move and to understand that everything is changing. So you need to be resilient. So that was the first thing that triggers me to try to adapt. So what I'm always looking for is how do I actually try to engage with what's going on, but also make the necessary changes if something is needed, to make it better. So that's what I'm currently working right now. But I think that may be that trigger point about what helped me to adapt, which is being resilient.
Yeah. And your parents didn't tell you that you were crazy when you had like a stable job and you changed again and again?
At first, yes. But then I mentioned to my dad, like, this is something that is happening. It's a new trend. Not many people are talking about it because what I want to do is gain experience,
Yeah.
And that actually landed me here because having a diverse set of experience within finance, commercial marketing, revenue management, supply gives you like even corporate relations. One of the hats I had in Diageo was actually being part of the corporate relations team. So it gives you a lot of perspective. And that's the cool thing.
Yeah, and you mentioned like all these functions that you've worked in. Like, why did you, like, unlike a lot of other finance professionals, but also a lot of other, I don't know, IT, sales, HR professionals that always stay in the same function, you decided to make cross-functional moves? Ultimately, I think that finance has been the key, the element that you've kept on going back to, but you've been in, pricing, for example. Why did you decide to do these cross-functional moves?
I think that what landed me in the space of having these experiences is I first wanted to be really good at the technical part of finance and then see what I can bring or what I can learn actually from other departments. What I wanted to become is actually someone that has a complete perspective about the business. And what I really look for is to be the guy that actually has the helicopter view when you can look at the whole forest and then get into the bushes and then go back. So to understand that, you actually need to pretty much understand it. What I always say is that finance is a place where you can be built to be a general manager because you actually see everything. If your scope is only around costing and preparing reports, then probably you're not going to get the experience that you need. But if you actually try to move and understand as a business partner, as a co-pilot of the business, what differentiates finance from the other departments is that you can move between everything. So that's what I actually did. It helped me a lot.
Yeah. And what does your current role I didn't even ask you, what does your current role at Reebok look like?
So now I'm the FD for Latin America and Caribbean markets.
Finance director, right?
Yeah. But working a lot as a co-pilot, managing the business, not only looking for finance. We look at retail performance, we look at e-commerce performance, supply. We've been doing a lot of changes within our structure and organization to be more productive and try to always, not lose market share because that the end game is about consumers. So that's what we need to focus. And we are an organization that maybe manages around 5,000 SKUs. So it's a completely different business that in Diageo, for example, where you have like 1,000 or 2,000 per year. Now you have 5,000 per semester or per fall, winter, or spring, summer. So you have maybe a lot of SKUs to manage. And that's the complexity about being in retail, I also have the B2C talent direct, because having to understand the consumer, to map the processes, to understand what you need to do to minimize risk with e-com in certain markets, with retail in certain markets, is something that I didn't have the experience before, but it's going really good right now.
And what type of team are you managing?
I have a team more than 20 people within all the markets directly. And people from accounting, we're starting to evolve from the FP&A department to a more strategic one. So what I also been focusing on is, and I think one of the strongest parts I have in my day to day is the strategic part. So I try to always not focus on the short term, but also look at the long term. So I'm trying to impose that with the team I'm working on right now.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And culturally, do you see a difference between apparel and FMCG? Or is it like more maybe a thing of the pace of the business as well, no?
I think it's the pace might be, I think it's pretty much the same, being honest. The pace and if you manage to understand the whole structure of the business, then it gets easier. But and in terms of culture, they're pretty much the same between retail and FMCG. But the pace you need to have to be in retail is different because things happen on a daily basis. So that's what you need to be like. Whenever you're in FMCG, you actually work through distributors. But whenever you have 60 stores and you have an e-commerce channel and you have regulations per market, then it's different. So you need to be ahead of the curve to understand what's happening.
Yeah. And as a finance director, I think that finance sometimes gets a bit of a bad rep in the way that it's only there like to authorize or not authorize investments from the business. I guess that you don't agree with that perception, but why do you think that finance may be perceived incorrectly?
I think that happened through the years that finance was seen as a cost-cutting department. What I try to focus is, cost cutting probably needs to happen whenever the results are not coming,
Yeah.
But what you need to focus on is actually to invest to try to grow. That's the first thing. And you need to be the best partner you can to, your main stakeholder is going to be your boss, but then you have other, for example, in my case, other directors, director of product marketing or retail, that you need to work hand by hand to understand the business and to keep it growing. So, if you put yourself in the space of I'm only cutting something and not looking at what I can bring if I invest, then it's going to be a big wall for you with other people.
Yeah.
That's something I wouldn't encourage a finance person to do. You need to look at the costs and the expenses and everything, but you need to understand what's happening outside of that. Because finance is mostly about driving impact rather than only seeing numbers. So that's pretty much what I think brings a little difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you think that, how would you define like finance's role as like a growth partner in either in FMCG or retail? I think you mentioned the word co-pilot.
Yeah, as I told you, the word co-pilot always resonates when I'm talking about finance and how it helps the business growing. What I would do, for example, if I were starting my career, in finance, you always need to see, as I shared before, not only see the numbers, but also see how to drive impact. That's the main reason why understanding what happens in a business, what happens in marketing, what's behind the investment, what are you trying to capture is key to keep growing. And strategically speaking, finance has the ability to see everything. So you're not only seeing the numbers, but you're seeing what's happening on the sides. And you're on the field. You're hand by hand with the marketing team. You're hand by hand with the product team, retail, e-com. So that's where you need to play. It's not like being a referee. It's more like playing in the field with them. Because you're probably one of the departments that has most information. So that's something, information and data is something that actually brings value. If you can just say that.
Information is power, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And what does it look like in the day to day? And maybe, I don't know, you can give me some examples to work like with the marketing person, the salesperson, to help that growth agenda.
For example, we have what I usually try to push is that is having at least 2 or 3 meetings per year, like a workshop between everyone to understand where are we and how do we want to move and where do we want to land. That's the first thing. We also need to have regular routines, daily and weekly. I pretty much with the sales directors and the marketing directors and the retail directors, I talk to them maybe at least 1 or 1 hour and a half daily to understand where are they, what do they need. That didn't actually happen when I was in Diageo because the rhythm was different. Whenever you have a B2B company, you have a different rhythm than a B2C. So that is something that I actually needed to adapt because, as I told you, the pace is a little bit different, but also the interactions needs to be easier because this business is about relations. So you need to have really good relations and work as a team. If you see yourself only as a department that is only gonna control the budget, then it's not gonna work. You need to be with them.
I guess that there's a big part also of like communicating that like to your colleagues in the right way and presenting yourself. I guess it in a genuine way, but also in a way that you really convey that you're looking for common objectives. No,
exactly, because you need to create relationships whenever you have like. Fortunately, I had people I always get along with, so it was easier for me. But either way, you need to create a relationship that helps the business grow. And you need to be always thinking about what can we do to bring value. So in order to do that, having good and strong relationships with your stakeholders and partners, it's going to be key.
Yeah. And in the same way, I'm sure that like prejudice and preconceptions can be harmful also for the other departments. Is there any type of advice you would give like people in sales, marketing, IT, to supply chain to better partner with finance? Like how can they like approach finance to get to build that good relationship that adds value in both directions?
I think maybe there can be like at least 2 or 3 things, being honest about what you're looking for with what you're doing. Involve finance first, because as I shared with you, you need to work as a team. If you work like a standalone department that only needs to get an approval, then it's going to be like a wall-to-wall relation. So basically, you need to involve finance at the beginning to understand and make them part of the journey and also part of the target. So that's going to be so much easier for a finance person to be involved, to be thankful that they were involved first, and to see that they are part of the team.
Yeah. Is that like the major pitfall that you've seen in these cases of like cross-functional work, that there's like that maybe they take too long to involve finance in the whole situation?
It happens in different cultures, in different companies. Probably they involve you at the middle, or they involve you on a side talk, or they involve you not at the beginning, but at the end only to map the budget. What you actually, as a finance person, need to do is to create that ecosystem between your partners to involve you first. Because once you are ahead of the curve, and that's what I always say, being co-pilot and being ahead of the curve is something that really differentiates you from understanding something at the end, because you can make these small changes to make an investment profitable, for example. And you can bring ideas. I mean, it happened to me. There are some cases where I am pretty much blindsided of what's going on a marketing strategy on e-com on a certain market. I'm trying to learn that, but there are things that I can probably bring a little bit of more value. Maybe on investment, on retail, how to look at the forward EBITDA. So those things are something that finance can bring value to someone.
Yeah, like you can actually be like a type of consultant, no, to an initiative that a department is trying to do, and really like maybe there's like they're blindsided on certain things that maybe early on it can be good to have like you as on the project, not so that they don't miss out on certain things.
Yes, I think it's about engagement. Once you create that engagement between every department, they work together for us as a whole team to do something. Whether if it's a small project, if it's launching something, a new brand, then it's easier.
Are there any like projects that you've seen like company wide in the companies that you've been, any like global initiatives that you found like interesting in terms of like, involving finance more or fostering that type of like cross-functional collaboration?
That's funny because when I was in Diageo, and this thing always comes to my mind whenever someone has tried to ask me something like that. We actually launched the first innovation in LATAM for Guinness, the beer produced locally, which was Guinness Smooth, which is Guinness Smooth. So it's produced in some markets, in Caribbean markets. And we actually were a team of 3 people. 1 head of finance, 1 head of commercial, 1 head of marketing. And between the 3, we need to manage the idea, the campaign, the price, the production, the ingredients, where to produce, the distributor. So it was a really great project. It worked. I mean, Guinness is a great beer, but it's also has a lot of penetration in Caribbean markets. Usually people really don't know that.
Really? I didn't
Caribbean
know.
markets, they drink a lot of Guinness.
Really? I thought that in the Caribbean markets, they drank more like lighter, fresher types of beer.
No, it's actually, in some markets, it's part of their culture. So they
like,
see Guinness.
For example?
80, for example, they look at it as a local beer. They even have it for breakfast. Yeah.
Wow.
Guyana, 80, Barbados, Trinidad. So they're pretty market that people usually think that Guinness could be big, but it's actually big. Yeah. So that project is something that I'm actually really proud of because I think with us as a team working together, we managed to land the first innovation for LATAM for an Irish brand, which is in some markets, yes, but no one would have thought that an innovation in Guinness could work, but it actually worked. And we do it with a different business model, mapping everything. I mean, where to produce, where to buy ingredients, the campaign, the investment, the follow-up. So that was a really great experience that really showed that as a team, you can create something.
And we're going like towards, and you mentioned before data, and every time there's more data points and decisions are going to be more data driven in theory. Finance is like an eminently data driven function, no? Because it's about numbers. So how is the like the emergence of data in terms of quantity, but also of like credibility affected finance, and how has it affected your job?
So it's an interesting thing because whenever I remember in PepsiCo, that was the first time, you always see like a P&L information and everything. I think when I was in Colgate, you had like market share information. But I remember the first time I got involved in managing big data was in PepsiCo, in revenue management, where I actually was part of a conjoined study. So the conjoined study was, you have the mom and pops in certain days of the week and certain stores, you put the price at 50 cents and then you put the price at 60 cents and you actually see what happens to the volume. So whenever I was involved in that project and was leading that, it was crazy because you had like real-time data on what people bought, what they bring. For example, a bag of chips of Lay's or a bag of chips of the Todito, which is called in Colombia. So managing that information and translate that into insights is something that whenever you see that is something that you actually try to pursue. So, okay, if I can get this information and translate it into an insight, then this probably is going to bring something. So my past experience, it was maybe like between 10 and 8 years ago. So what is happening now, I cannot even imagine if I were managing the information from an inside perspective. Because what usually you see is presentations. I mean, we had a study of 60% of the people now is looking more on the athleisure segment. So you have new players that are gaining market share 4%, 5%, but you don't see what's behind that data that is happening. So whenever you're working around that, it's really valuable.
So normally when we talk about data, I mean, mostly because this podcast we speak about with marketing, sales, insights people, but not so much with finance. So because it's interesting, you're talking about all this market data. What is how does finance interact with this market data, insights, and so on?
So, for example, in Diageo, there is an annual meeting called the strategic conference. So, in that strategic conference, you actually show numbers where you want to grow. But what is behind that is a lot of efforts between different departments, but also a lot of information because you have consumer information. What are they consuming? What's the trend, for example, in Johnny Walker Red in Dominican Republic? What's the trend on Buchanan's in Panama? How is the performance of Olpar in Peru? So you actually manage big data around sellout and consumer disposition to pay, and you landed that into an strategy. So let's say, for example, and that is actually something that most companies want to follow, is that in 3 to 4 years, you need to double the business because everyone is doing that. So if you don't double the business in your statement, then you're doing something wrong probably. But that's what the companies are following. So in order to do that, you need to create strategies to keep growing the sellout or the consumption. So to do that, then you need to get information. And that's something, for example, in Diageo, in most FMCGs, you have that information. But I was involved directly in the part of the strategic annual planning, showing the results for the next 5 to 10 years. And I could see directly what the information is managed. So you have information. And with information, then you can get to a landed space more safely.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And do you think is there a fear in finance or with finance people that all this data and a certain automation, AI and so on will make your job obsolete at some point? Or what type of impact do you think it will have on finance professionals?
So I think we're actually seeing it now. I mean, there are some parts in finance where it can be automated if you have the right systems, but having the right systems is probably not something that every company can have because it's involved around an additional cost. It's involved around how you change the culture. My point of view is that finance is always going to be needed, but that's the reason why probably the CFO role has evolved from the reporting, cost controlling to the strategic, to being the co-pilot of the business. So I think that AI can bring value. I mean, if you manage it correctly, but finance is always going to be needed because it's your go-to person. Yeah, it's your go-to person if you want to translate something, into a business impact.
Yeah.
For good or for bad. So AI could definitely help because it's going to make things easier. I mean, probably now, I remember maybe 3 years ago whenever I just started working with Copilot, I was part of let's say the testing team to work around that. That was my first experience. I didn't know what ChatGPT or anything, but it was like the first glance of how AI actually worked. But now I think pretty much everyone has OpenAI open. I mean, in their Google Chromes or Safari, to ask something. How do I actually do this? Something that could have taken 10 minutes now takes 30 seconds probably to resolve. So I think it definitely there is value, but I don't see it as a threat. I see it as a complement.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other levers that I think more and more I mean, I think in apparel, it's always something important, but now in FMCG, people are talking about it a lot. Levers to win in the market is innovation, new product innovation, commercial innovation, a lot of different types of innovation. Mm-hmm. Finance is not typically associated to it, but I know that you personally think there is a role finance, a decisive role finance can play in that.
So when I used to think that when I was working for KPMG, but I understand that these global monsters in FMCG, they have innovation processes or what they call gate processes. And finance is as you say, is a pillar for that. So you have always a finance person involved since the gate zero, which is the ideation part. So, and I actually had one of those roles when I was in the IO, where we landed innovations. Okay, so what do we need to do? Maybe there is an opportunity to create, I want to say, Smirnoff Ice locally in Trinidad. We need to launch a new flavor. People are asking, we have competition working around. Okay. So you map the idea, you are part of the idea, and then you have gates where you present documents, information, data that support your project. But finance starts at the beginning of that stage. And hopefully I had the benefit of working in companies where innovation is hand by hand with finance. So they are mapped since the beginning. Whenever I was in Colgate, Procter, Teva, even the pharmaceutical company, they had that process. PepsiCo, Diageo, and now with Reebok, they actually have that starting process to look at collabs, because collabs is now the name of the game in retail. Exactly. But the other markets were actually focusing on innovation, and finance starts at the beginning of that. So, fortunately for me, I was involved since the beginning. But it's definitely key. Otherwise, you are missing something. Because I remember we had a lot of space when I was in the IO to try to produce locally, and also get the product from other place. But whenever you have already a local production, it's probably easier for you to launch something. So, and you can get it more, let's say, culturally related to Latin America, you know? So that's also important because innovations are now not only following a global trend, they're actually following a more regional trend. So there are markets where a flavor would work so much better than another. So that's something you need to map. And finance is key to that because probably that ingredient is expensive to get, or someone needs to understand what the value chain is. So finance is there to provide how the value chain moves from the production to the consumption.
Yeah. So interesting. I think that's an interesting one that you say that innovations, even in global companies, I think that may surprise people that they're more local or regional, as you said, than one could think. No, I think that especially like in foods, beverages, that happens a lot. No.
Exactly, it happens a lot. I mean, as I told you, I heard so many companies that try to innovate but involve finance first, so that doesn't actually share it as a team, but they manage every innovation as a standalone department, which could work. But I mean, it's always important to translate that into an impact. So to me, the first person that is actually involved in that time or space is someone from finance to understand what that could bring, the value that it brings, and how to make it happen. You know?
And looking at other like finance leaders from people that you know or hear about from other people in other departments, what would your like advice be to people that are listening? Like, how can they make the most out of their role right now?
So probably the first advice I could say is that not to only focus on the technical part. I mean, being technically good is easier for you because you get things faster. But I think you need to be more exposed to different things. So try to look out for those experiences, even if it's out of finance, sorry. in different departments because you understand different points of view and now you get why you're doing things. And that's how you actually be more involved and understand different points of views and get a holistic view. So I think that would make things a lot easier for someone in finance. I would have loved starting looking at that earlier in my career, not only being technically good. And I'm a true believer that experiences really give you differentiation. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in your case, the fact that the fact that you've made changes when you had to do them, the fact that you've gone international, the fact that you've done these cross-functional moves are definitely something. And I think that hearing you, it's quite clear that have set you apart. Moving forward, like, what is your personal vision for your own career?
So that's a really good question. So I was trying to think that maybe 1 year ago, the only thing I'm clear is that I, I really like co-piloting a business. Looking at numbers is good, but the role where you can actually move things around is something that brings passion to me. So what I learned actually from the experience I had before is being the co-pilot. It actually brings you that let's say fast-paced actions on your day-to-day basis, but also on how do you want to evolve as a professional. I am now the FD for a brand, but probably my next step will be to be the FD or CFO for a group of brands, or maybe move to a general management role where you can actually be the hands-on person that needs to drive the business growing, because now finance is like on the right side, of the general management. The whole risk is on the general management. You need to be part of them and helping them to reach their targets, but it's a different perspective. So probably landing in a space of general management or group CFO of brands could be something that is appealing to me in the next years.
So you think that in the future that we'll still get CEOs coming from finance?
I think so, yeah. Even I see a lot of trends that the CFOs and the CEOs are actually people that were probably not in FP&A, that are actually coming from data. I mean, I saw, I remember it was maybe a couple of months ago. Someone told me, look at this profile from some guy in LinkedIn where he moved from marketing to finance and then to CEO. So I think that touching the different departments is important for you to understand that. So that is something that could happen.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, you've done a lot of things in your career, and I'm curious to know, and this is our famous last question, which is, if you went back to yourself at the beginning, which started, I think, very early because you were still at university when you started working, but if you could give yourself one piece of advice, given everything that you've learned, what would it be?
I think the best advice I could say is to be open to different experiences. The earlier, the better. So there is nothing that can bring back time. So understanding different point of views, understanding different schemes, different departments, why they are doing things, brings you a different perspective. So probably that would be the main thing I can say about that. But also to understand that finance is not just about looking at numbers, it's driving impact. So you need to understand how to drive the impact. So the sooner you understand that, it's going to be so much easier for you to interact with different persons. So
I agree. I think that in every function, really, it's important to understand where the overall business is going. Because I think it gives a lot more sense to your overall job and mission, if you like. It's not always easy, of course, because sometimes your day-to-day job is very demanding and doesn't let you think of the bigger picture. But I'm going to try to summarize a bit what we've talked about. I have a lot of notes, so I'm not going to be able to say everything. But I think it was interesting actually, and I'm going to ask you, like, you started at KPMG or Deloitte where you were still at university. Is that the commonplace in Peru when you grew up to like be working while at university?
Yeah. At least for me, it was. I am probably the last part of the millennial stage. So they are people mostly whenever they are in last year, a little bit. Yeah, last year of the university, I started working. Usually these companies, they try to help you with the hours. So you have classes and you have the project, you have the thesis and everything. So they try to help you a lot in that part. But at least for me, it was a common thing. I remember when I was in Peru, I had trainees that were maybe in third year of university. University usually lasts 5. For at least for Peru, it's common. I know that in some markets it's different because, for example, in Panama here, then you need to do it, but on the last year, only the last year.
Yeah, here the same. In Spain, it's the same. I mean, I did some work on the side as an English teacher, but I only really started working in an office in my last year. But I think that even like doing an odd job before you go into an office adds a lot of value. I think it's a bit like what you were saying, like the earlier you start getting experiences, the better in a lot of ways. But along these lines, I also like the fact that the philosophy that you had, that you wanted to be very good at finance, but then also understand other departments when you took cross-functional moves to get and what we're talking about, like getting a complete perspective of the business and having that a helicopter view. The vision that you have of finance as a co-pilot, like really being in the next seat of the general manager or CEO, really seeing the key decisions that the business is taking. You have a lot of experience in FMCG, but now you're in apparel, and you mentioned the complexity that it has. Not only that you're managing like maybe more than double the number of SKUs, but also the different channels, right? Like from working with wholesalers to going like retail, direct wholesalers as well, direct retail, physical retail, direct to consumer. That makes a lot of difference.
Exactly.
I think that, I think a lot of this conversation is really like about breaking a bit the stereotype around finance, like, a cost-cutting department. You put it like to being that growth partner, really, right? And that comes down to understanding how you can drive impact, like what happens in the business and what's happening in marketing and sales and supply chain, and trying to capture value across these departments. We talked about like how to actually do that, which was interesting. So you really talked about building relationships, being transparent, and really in some way not automatizing, but like really like standardizing that relationship. So having a regular meeting across departments. So there's the transparency. And I think that you also mentioned that goes back to the other departments as well, that it's a good idea to have finance on board in innovation processes, but also in the day-to-day, and really like foster that team and interdepartmental type of relationship. Again, we talked about the role of innovation. I discovered that Guinness is very popular in some countries of the Caribbean, like Haiti, which I thought was very interesting. And then we talked about like data automation, AI, and the fact that it is transforming finance. But I think that we'll agree that it is helping in that way of like going from reporting, which a lot of it will start to be automatized, to be more like that strategic partner, right? Fantastic, Jose. This was a lot of fun, I have to say.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Daniel. For me, it was getting to know you was amazing, and be part of this is helping me a lot to understand this word of the podcast you have, which is amazing. Thank you again for giving me the space, and hopefully we can talk later.
I'm sure we will, and thanks also for coming on. And now that you'll be both, a listener, but also part of the wider FMCG Guys family as a guest. So thanks so much for joining. Thanks to all our listeners for joining as well, and we'll see you in the next episode of the FMCG Guys. Have a great day.